So we've got a panel here. This is the second of the events that have been organised by the Programme for African Leadership here at the LSE, the International Development at the LSE. Those of you who don't know, the Programme for African Leadership is a new initiative where we have had the tremendous good fortune and privilege to be able to offer a number of scholarships to Africans to come here and study. And they are really taking the lead on putting together this series of events looking at South Sudan and asking the same question in each case: what went wrong and what can be done about it? We had a very interesting event the other night where the Sudanese minister was talking about, foreign minister was talking about these issues, and we have another event on the 18th of March where we're going to look at the regional dynamics. But today we're going to focus on the internal dynamics, and we have three speakers who've had a great deal of experience about these events. Do we have an order? Who's going first?
I think Thomas.
Thomas.
Would I?
Yeah.
Sorry, apparently you've been elected to go first.
Just elected, right?
Thomas.
Cannot decline.
Yeah. Actually, I'm looking at my notes here, and I don't actually know where you're located at the moment, Thomas. I always see you at these events, but
Right.
what institution do you represent?
No, I present myself as independent entity.
Entirely independent entity. Thomas is an entirely independent entity who speaks truth to power and lies. That is his role tonight. All right? And then we have Marika Shumeris, who's been a member of the department here for quite a while now and has been working on South Sudan for many years, and is, unlike many other scholars, has had the chance to do really serious field work inside South Sudan, and has been in Juba quite recently, but has also done some really thorough field work in western Equatoria part of South Sudan in particular. And as some of you will know, she's just published a book looking at the border regions between South Sudan and Sudan, an edited collection. So she's very much an authority on the current situation in South Sudan. And then to sum everything up and to take us forward into a really lively and exciting discussion, we have Alex Dowling with us, who was being a bit cagey about where he's affiliated, and he said, well, if I tell you that he's been in South Sudan for 5 years as working on security sector reform, you'll all think that he was working for a security organisation, or maybe he's like a sort of a young, handsome James Bond. But he denies that completely, and he's going to be talking about. He's going to be. I just thought I'd put it on the table so that you can deny it openly. He's going to be discussing issues to do with security sector reform in South Sudan, and maybe reflect on to what extent some of those processes have been perhaps even part of the problem. So, Thomas, with no further ado, do you want to launch forth for about 15 minutes?
Thank you, Tim. Hello, everybody. I just hope you could hear me, but I'm going to try my best, because often, it's very difficult to know whether the people at the back can hear you or not. Okay. So today, basically, the subject that we are discussing today is try to answer a couple of questions. What went wrong, and what can be done about it? Okay. Basically, looking at internal dynamics of a post-war nation building. That's the case of South Sudan. So the first thing I would like to say is that the South Sudanese people adore their country. They are staunchly defensive of it. They want its sovereignty and they want its unity. This is something that we all agree on. But at the same time, and we know that there was an evidence. The evidence for that is the popular vote, where 80% of the population voted and 98% of them voted for independence. They, however, the South Sudanese, however, differ bitterly often on how this country should be organized and how it should be governed. This is, of course, true for every country, not just specific to South Sudan. But however, the destructive way in which South Sudan have historically expressed their differences has harmed the welfare of South Sudan. It has also created a doubt about the commitment of the South Sudanese to their country. So now we're going to talk about what factors led to the crisis that we are looking at the moment. And what I would say about that is very difficult for any one person or even any group of people to identify all the factors that led to this problem. So what we're trying to do, I'm going to have, from my perspective, list just quite a few, how I see them. The first factor really is that at the creation of the state of South Sudan, there were enormous challenges that were going to be difficult for any government. Just to mention a few, South Sudan is a huge country the size of France, but it has no tarmac roads at all. The only tarmac road that exists at the moment is one that was donated by the United States to link Juba with Numili, which is the border town on the border of Uganda, identifying it as a strong link, the main path really for external trade for South Sudan. Apart from that, all the other roads are more or less impassable during the rainy season, and that's quite long, could be about 5 to 6 months. Equally, 70% of the South Sudanese have never gone to school. 83% of South Sudanese live in rural areas where they live on subsistence farming, which cannot actually supply the growing population in the urban areas. Infant mortality and maternity mortality are amongst the highest in the world. Because of this, about 50% of all the food that is needed in urban areas, plus all the manufactured and non-manufactured and semi-manufactured goods have to be imported, mostly really through the same route that I've mentioned to you, Uganda-Juba link. That means that a huge proportion of the scarce oil revenue that we get goes towards these imports, which is basically a huge loss for the country. South Sudan has a huge potential for agricultural production. In addition to that, we have maybe 100,000, 200,000 formerly displaced South Sudanese in North Sudan, neighboring countries, and further afield that are yet to return to South Sudan and be accommodated to find jobs, places of residence, and so on. So against these enormously difficult challenges, I believe that any government would have failed, but particularly the government of South Sudan was quite ill-equipped. The South Sudanese, when they voted for independence, had very, very high hopes, extremely high hopes, and this is the second factor, that unrealistic expectations. And if you could remember, if anybody remembers John Garang, he used to say that disappointment is a factor of expectations. And nobody told South Sudanese that South Sudan is not going to be like Uganda in 5 years, nor is it going to be like Kenya, nor is it going to be like Europe. And some people thought, why can't it not be like the UK? Why can't it not be run like the UK right now? And nobody told them that this is going to take decades to be like the neighboring countries, and perhaps a century or more, if at all, to be anywhere similar to a developed country. So in addition to these two factors, there's a problem of governance. Considering the unrealistic expectations, as I've said, the government was bound to fail. However, the government of South Sudan contains many structural weaknesses which rendered it too weak to live up to the task. So just to enumerate some of the weaknesses that the government had, the first thing is there was a lack of capacity in the government of South Sudan, and this was a result of two things. First, we had 50 years of war where human development had been undermined, whether it was through education or through work. Almost 50 years of war. In addition to that, when the SPLM came into power, in order for it to reward and encourage and redevelop the people who had contributed to the liberation, they actively also worked very hard to exclude the rest of South Sudanese, amongst whom there would have been very, very good people all over the world, and as well within Sudan and South Sudan, that could have helped establish the government more strongly. Second factor is corruption. The corruption was obviously is a menace in all societies, but in South Sudan it was particularly made worse by the conditions of the war, where there was impunity and people with guns had power over people who had no guns and could sometimes be violent and threatening. Also, the conditions of the bush could not allow for any reasonable fiscal system to be put into place. So obviously they came back into power with the same legacy, which is going to take them a longer time to establish anything reasonable. Also, there's an issue of regionalism, tribalism, and sub-tribalism, which has actually affected the rule of the government of South Sudan. When the rebellion started in 1983, or even if we go back a bit further, the British, when they left the Sudan in 1956, they had left a very small but very functioning civil service among South Sudanese. And those people continue to be quite key throughout Sudan, and they were used later on in many areas of the north. The hope was that this small, the hope at independence will be this small tier will then train the subsequent generations, and then knowledge will filter down, and South Sudan might start to develop. Unfortunately, the subsequent wars held that back. And to make things worse, during the SPLM war, the SPLM had moved mainly as educated students, university leavers, lecturers, secondary school leavers to start the liberation. And they very quickly found that the population, the numbers required for the revolution were not sufficient, and they had to utilize the numbers of the rural population that they had settled amongst. So the policy was for young people, they have to prove themselves in the field in terms of military capability, and many uneducated young people became senior commanders, effective commanders, which, because the criteria for excellence had changed, education became not the first priority at all. That became the first criteria and became undermined. What that meant is that the ideas of development and revolutionary ideas, liberal ideas that had been established through the 50s, 60s, and 70s among the educated class of South Sudanese started to be diminished. And now it looks as if the traditional, more conservative, more inward-looking South Sudan was claiming really itself back. And by the time we came back into this government, the characteristics that we saw in this government are not similar to any characteristics that we've seen before in how South Sudan was managed by the Southerners themselves. At the same time, the SPLM also worked to undermine the leadership, the traditional leadership in South Sudan in the form of chiefs, in favor of individuals that were more inclined to support the revolution. Yes, it worked for the revolution, but it actually undermined the rule of law and order amongst the civil rural population, which basically ushered the country for many, many problems that we've seen recently between tribal wars and so on, that used to be more easily maintained in the past. Also, the SPLM had internal problems, historical problems. The first of them was the fallout in 2004 between Kiir, who was the deputy for the previous SPLM leader, John Garang. It was a huge crisis that threatened to split the SPLM in two. Although this problem was solved by the South Sudanese themselves, by the movement itself, peacefully, but the cracks that were created remained until today. It created a lack of some level of bitterness and a lack of trust between the two teams. The two sides, however, decided to cooperate until the independence was achieved. But the mistrust between the camps of the pro-Garang and the pro-Kiir remained until today. Also, as part of the SPLM historical divisions, there is a factor of Riek Machar. Riek Machar, who was a close ally of John Garang at the time, we all know that he split from the movement in 1991. Later on joined Khartoum, took a large number of the SPLM forces with him, played a big role in Khartoum winning, having access to the oil-rich parts of Upper Nile, exploiting them subsequently, enriching itself, and using that advantage against South Sudan. Even though Riek returned many years later to the ranks of the SPLM, and he was welcome, it is an open secret that amongst the ranks and file in South Sudan, that Riek was never going to be allowed to lead the SPLM or South Sudan again. So that's another factor. The SPLM, as we've seen them, the leadership, they haven't shown any sign of working effectively as a team. Yes, I think maybe their greatest success was to work hard between between the signing of the CPA and the final implementation through the referendum. That was a job well done. But apart from that, they worked as individuals and as cliques against each other. Then there was also the northern threat, and we've seen that, of course, especially the border issues of Hijlij and Abyei, several reincursions this actually forced the government of South Sudan and the Parliament of South Sudan to allocate more than 60% of the oil revenue towards defense. And this is what we've been told. That meant that the wealth has been redirected from development, from other things, into this particular important aim that all South Sudanese had agreed was important. But also, in addition to that, there were the wrangling over oil and the oil fairs, which forced the South Sudanese government to shut the oil down for almost a complete year. Although we understand that many positive things have come out of this. For example, many observers thought that it was not clear who owned the oil before that, but now after that, because of the agreements that were signed later on between South Sudan and Khartoum, it became very clear that the oil is southern, that it is that the arrangement of exporting the oil through Sudan were temporary, and South Sudan was free to have other arrangements, Ethiopia or Kenya, or whoever else, from which they can export, through which they can export the oil. Big advantages, plus also that it was set for 3 years and that the rates to be paid were mutually agreed by both sides. However, set against these advantages, there was the fact that there was no income for South Sudan over a whole year, which was created a big hole in the economy of the country and affected the politics, the internal politics of South Sudan. It was said that South Sudan development or growth rate reached just about minus 40% that year. A big collapse of the economy. Then there was the SPLA identity. The SPLA as a fighting force, as they came at the peak of their victory in 2005 and they arrived in South Sudan, it became very clear to the leaders of the SPLM that unity has to be achieved between South Sudanese. As a result, there was a policy of absorbing South Sudanese militia that were pro-Khartoum, with promise that their ranks would be maintained, their payments would be maintained, and that they would be absorbed within the SPLM and treated equally with the other SPLM, older SPLM members. To the extent that by December, the militia constituted the majority of the army, up to 70%. Obviously, this is a success for the unity of South Sudan, but also it was a security risk and a security threat for the country. Finally, historically, the South Sudanese politicians have had the tendency to use tribal differences and ethnicity in order to foster their political ambitions and so on. And the worst example is the recent events that we have seen. So what are the solutions? I'm not going to claim that there are solutions at all, but we could discuss them. I can talk, for example, about the possible ends of this current war. So this current war, which is only 3 months old, can end with an outright victory for Kir, an outright victory for Riek, a coalition government containing both men, a coalition government containing neither of the men, or turning South Sudan into a form of Somalia, where the government will collapse under the pressure of the rebels. But with the rebels themselves failing to establish a government, and therefore South Sudan just sinks into this chaos for years to come. Obviously, this is an extreme example, but there are more worse and more extreme examples where, for example, South Sudan could be recolonized, put under the UN, for example, or even worse, under the African Union, or even another country. South Sudan could be dismembered, where it could be broken up, where big, stronger countries like Ethiopia or Sudan or Kenya or Uganda could take a part of it. Or we could just keep on like now, forever, keep the status quo, and the fighting goes on for years and years and years. Of course, these are all undesirable, especially the first 2 scenarios. Kir outright victory over Riek Machar outright victory over Kir militarily would cost so many South Sudanese lives that none of us would want that outcome. Maybe the only way out is some sort of coalition, and this would require a lot of sacrifice, a lot of thinking amongst us. It's not going to be a matter of justice. It's not a matter of justice. It's not a matter of who is right, who is wrong, but it's a matter of, can South Sudan survive? Can I do something in order for this country to survive? Also, assuming that a peace agreement is reached between these two groups. I think it's essential that before the peace is finalized, that the civil society is allowed to have a say. And there are many, many areas where civil societies can contribute very much for the future of South Sudan. For example, the finalization of the permanent constitution for South Sudan, how we can rebuild the national army, the law and order system, fiscal system, civil service, and other things. There are also things like the service delivery. Other issues about what form of development do we want? Do we want a sustainable development, or do we want a destructive development where the oil is going to run out and there's nothing left afterwards? So we need to think about something sustainable, alternative energy, or sustain and improve our existing subsistence farming rather than try and replace it with some sort of intensive farming that's not going to take South Sudan many years to keep and maintain. These are just general ideas, things that civil society can contribute. It's very important. This will be the opportunity for people to come in, different groups, different trade unions and think tanks and things like that, to bring ideas to the fore. That's my contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think we're going to move straight to Maraika. Are you going to come up here?
Over here, yeah. Is there a microphone here?
You can have mine.
Okay.
I'll move down then. Okay.
Thank you. Can you hear me in the back as well? Or is it I have a very small voice, so I will try and shout and project. Thanks very much, Thomas. I'm trying to build in many ways on what Thomas has said, but also give you a slightly different perspective on some of the recent events and maybe how these link to some things in the past. I think one of the really interesting or slightly astounding reactions has been that the international community has seemed to be almost frozen in shock by these developments. And it's 3 months into this crisis, and there's actually still a very, very great uncertainty amongst international actors of how to react with this. And in many ways, it's often described as a really unforeseeable and unusual situation. And what I'm going to try and do is give a slightly different perspective of internal dynamics, which might help to untangle this frozen moment of shock and actually give some more constructive approaches to dealing with this crisis. Because what I think actually is a more realistic view of South Sudan is that it has been in some sort of permanent crisis almost since Sudan's independence. It's been ups and downs, and there have been peaceful periods, and there have been very, very violent periods. But ultimately, overall, it is, I think, quite fair to say that South Sudan or Southern Sudan hasn't really ever settled into a moment of non-crisis. And what that means, I think, for the current situation is it would be a much more useful way of thinking about it, that this is not a moment of dealing with one particular crisis, but actually a more permanent searching for solutions that really engages with how things work in South Sudan is long overdue and really important. And there's 2 points that I will come back to over again in what I'm going to talk about very briefly, that I think 2 important reminders are useful in looking in the South Sudanese context. One is that whenever there was a solution on the table or a solution was attained, it was very often reached through very problematic means. And I think what we see is that it comes time and time again, it comes back to haunt people. So I give you a very obvious example. So of course, liberation, independence was an absolute solution for many, many people, or it seemed like a solution. But it was, of course, obtained through very problematic means of fighting a very brutal war also on the shoulders of southern civilians. And the second thing is that actually, very often, problems are created by establishing a solution. And again, I give you a very obvious example. What seemed like a wonderful idea at the time was holding democratic elections actually created a whole set of other new problems. Of course, as you all know, a lot of the violence in South Sudan now has its beginnings, or has some part of its beginnings in post-election violence or post-election grudges. So you have these really 2 prominent themes of attaining solutions through problematic means and creating problems by establishing solutions. And I think that's a theme or a lens that's quite useful to use to understand South Sudan, because the main point I want to make through everything that I'm going to say is that things in South Sudan are so very often contradictory, and it doesn't mean that they are not true. It doesn't mean that you need to kind of find out more, but it's really, there's a lot of contradictions at work here at all times, and I think it's very difficult to engage with these contradictions, particularly in the current situation where everybody is so desperate to find sort of the right way of dealing with the crisis. So I'll very briefly give you an overview of what I'm actually going to talk about. As Tim said, I went to Juba in January to try and do some research. And before I left, a lot of people thought I won't be able to do much research. People were so scared. A lot of people weren't in Juba, of course. A lot of people had left during the crisis. And I went to Juba and I sort of played with a few ideas, and then ultimately came up with an idea to do two things. One was conduct interviews with sort of higher ranking people who would be comfortable to talk, and the second thing, to reach as much as possible into the population. It was really very difficult to speak to ordinary people who had been under attack and who had seen what had happened in Juba. So what we did in the end was to think about, well, who are the people who might be a little more comfortable talking and who also could do this sort of in private. And we came up with a self-administered survey in English, which we handed out to randomly sampled international and national NGOs, to media organizations, to journalists, to academics and think tanks, and to members of the church or church people. So I worked with two colleagues here, Anouk and Eddie, Anouk and I designed the survey, and Eddie gave a lot of very useful feedback. And it was interesting to see what had happened, because even the people with whom I was working to administer the survey said, well, nobody's going to answer this. And we handed out 500, and actually 250 came back. And a lot of them came back with really very interesting information. Now, there's obviously problems with this kind of data. So, I mean, the first one is, yes, in this particular presentation, I will only give you information from people who are literate and who are English speaking and who have a job, which is obviously not at all representative of South Sudanese population. The other obvious caveat is that there, amongst the 250 respondents, one person identified as a Nuer speaker, because at that moment in time, and until now, of course, Nuer people are not in their employment positions. So those are a few problems. And maybe a next problem is that, yes, because of the nature of the survey, some of these categories, some of the questions that we ask people are sort of pre-phrased. They use a particular language. However, we also had a lot of open text boxes where we asked very open questions, like how should South Sudan be governed? And how do you think this crisis came about? So it was a bit of a mixture. So I give you a first idea. So the first, I read it out in case it's a little bit too small in the back. So one of the questions we ask is, to what extent do you agree that any of the following can bring an end to the current crisis and bring improvements for the future? And some of the options, I don't give you complete data, it's just sort of snapshots. Some of the options were negotiations in Addis, other negotiations in South Sudan, a military solution, peacekeeping, or prosecution in a court of law. And this is already really very interesting. So obviously you see here that there's very strong support, 70% for negotiations in Addis Ababa, not as much, 44% in South Sudan, very strong opposition against a military solution, and then sort of much more mellow when it comes to peacekeeping and prosecution in a court of law. So what we see from this data, it seems at first sight as if the negotiations in Addis Ababa seem like a very good idea. However, I started by saying that in the history of South Sudan, solutions always, or not always, but often create problems. And I think one of the things that we're seeing already, that the setup of the negotiations in Addis Ababa is very reminiscent of some of the problems that would occur during the negotiations of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. Of course, a lot of the actors around the table are the same and so on. So there's really a repetition, and it seems very much to be the case, as if issues that were unaddressed during the CPA negotiations actually do remain unaddressed right now. But nonetheless, because it is obviously an internationally very strongly supported initiative, the negotiations in Addis Ababa, this may be a logical answer, but there's something missing here, which the next question sets up as a very interesting contradiction, one of those contradictions that I talked about. Because we also asked people, do you consider yourself a supporter of either one of the parties negotiating in Addis Ababa? And of course, we didn't ask, who do you support? But we just asked, are you supporting either side? And this is a really striking result, which is that 73% of people say, no, I'm not supporting either side of these negotiations. So actually, when you look at this data, you find out that whatever happens in Addis Ababa doesn't really link back to, a flippant way of saying it would be, these don't seem to be peace talks for the people very much. It's an important process, but it doesn't connect to how people feel represented. And I think the certain disconnect between leadership and people is also very much a hallmark of South Sudanese politics. It's one of those patterns that has come back over and over again. And I mean, Thomas obviously touched on a lot of those points in his presentation. I think one of the dangers that we see is that right now there's so much hope attached and so many resources attached already to the Addis Ababa negotiations, but relying on a solution that ultimately seems to be brought about by leaders who have no legitimacy, that hardly seems like a very good way, or it seems like a pretty certain way to create some sort of further problems. So moving on, we also asked people what can bring an end to the current, sorry, this is the second part of the question, what can bring an end to the current crisis and improvements for the future? A few other things that were interesting. So you have national dialogue is quite supported, although in some of the responses people say, well, we don't actually really know what national dialogue is or what it could look like. And then you have international sanctions on individuals. That's interesting because at the time when we were doing this, there was a lot of talk about possibly freezing bank accounts and so on, but it doesn't convince people very much that that would do very much. Organizing a truth-telling process, 50%, I'll talk about that in a second. And then constitutional and electoral review process, of course, hints very much at some of the very sort of painful political processes that the South Sudanese have observed in recent months and maybe even years. But the truth-telling is interesting. So when people talk about the truth-telling, they talk about going back to SPLA atrocities in the past, some of the unresolved things that came out of the various leadership struggles. But of course, the truth-telling also points to another problem about the general relationship between the leadership, the elites, exactly those people who are now in Addis Ababa, and ordinary people who feel very much that the truth has never been told about the extent to which they paid for South Sudan's independence. And the role of elites is extremely important and remains very important because, of course, achieving independence was very much by credit of the elites, and people really appreciate this. So again, that's sort of one of these contradictions that are being set up. This is an answer from one of the open text boxes when we just asked people, what do you think was the cause of the crisis? And this is what one person wrote. And some people wrote pages. They filled the back pages of the survey and so on. And this is interesting because it's a lot of things that, some of them also that Thomas has listed, past experience, traditional beliefs and so on. But I was particularly struck by this, not having a sense of nationalism by many South Sudanese. Again, Thomas talked about this desire for unity. And I found that really striking, that after independence has been celebrated so strongly not that long ago, this is seen as a cause of a crisis, not having a sense of nationality by many South Sudanese. But I think it again points us to this notion that often the solutions were brought about by very violent means. Independence came about through very, very violent and brutal ways. And I think this is now sort of coming back in different ways. And independence, again, I said, solutions often create problems. Independence now comes with new problems, because even though the country is independent, the sense of nationalism hasn't yet been created, and it becomes the cause of a crisis. So you see again how very complicated the intertwining is there. And of course the referendum, both the referendum and the elections, were also very problematic. They came with a lot of really difficult experience of people voting, which wasn't always a pleasant experience, and the end result, particularly of the referendum, hides that very well. It's not really a very credible end result to have such a high number of people voting for one particular outcome, and it reflects the experience that many people had. But one of the major characteristics of the independence, as you will all remember, was of course it came with huge enthusiasm. But again, it's necessary to take a step back of what happened before, because it also came with a complete lack of civic education. A lot of people had very little idea either what the voting process was supposed to do to them or what independence might actually look like. And this was an interesting quote, again from the open text boxes, about the cause of the crisis. Somebody who talks about this idea that actually independence was a rather sort of uninformed achievement for a lot of the South Sudanese, who in this particular phrasing, the ordinary people who got brainwashed by the ambitious, power-hungry politicians which dragged them down to support the unknown. So independence, again, a contradiction. It was a jubilant moment, and there's no doubt, I think, that most South Sudanese really, really wanted this. But on the other hand, it was also the unknown, and the unknown is very unstable and very volatile. It can be very, very violent. So these, often you hear people talk about the leaders in very bad ways, and I think I don't disagree as such with a lot of these labels and a lot of the problems that also Thomas has pointed out. But I think they're also dangerous. They're also too simple to simply say we have a problem of corruption, we have a problem of power struggle and so on. Because they are accurate, but they also take away a lot of the agency. If we only look at lack of capacity and lack of infrastructure, we overlook that actually there is a lot of capacity, and there's a lot of different types of infrastructure. So something really, really strong exists in South Sudan, and I think people very easily overlook this in a moment of crisis. And I talked a lot about contradiction. One of these contradictions is that the most cherished institutions also become the most hated. So it kind of goes, it ricochets back and forth. And this is a striking one because it's about who are the actors, who are the underlying causes of the crisis. And you can see here, this is the answer for SPLA, 78%, this is the answer for SPLM. 90% of people said they strongly disagree that the SPLM is a cause of the crisis. So an easy conclusion from that would be the SPLM either needs to go, or it needs to be reformed, or there needs to be a very strong multi-party democracy. All these seem obvious, obvious points. And this again is from one of the text boxes. If you read this again, it very much strengthens this idea that the SPLM as an institution can no longer function. And here people really very clearly say, this person wrote to hell with SPLM. But it isn't as easy, and there is more contradiction, because the SPLM remains incredibly important as a brand because of everything that has happened. People have a very strong attachment to it, which is another contradiction, but it's very clear it's very visible in the fact that the opposition didn't go for finding another party, but they stepped back and they said, we're the SPLM in opposition. So they kept a hold of this particular name, even though the name is clearly also tainted. So again, one of those contradictions. And it's also important to keep in mind that all the opposition members, not all of them, but many of them, were members of the government for a long time, which also created a certain amount of the conditions that people now really struggle with. And this is one of the points I find very, very striking. One answer was, do you agree that the following are the underlying causes of the current crisis? And the answer was political culture. And you see that 71% say political culture is a very, very strong component of this current crisis. And if we break this down, and again, it's important to remember that some people who are now in opposition were in government and also created this political culture that people now really struggle with. And it's broken down in specifics: culture of corruption, culture of tribalism, regionalism, exclusion or marginalization, or intimidation. 70% of people talk about intimidation. So you have here actually a very interesting set of grievances, which on the one hand acknowledges that the government has really not treated its people very well. But on the other hand, not very many people directly say these leaders have done something bad for us, but they very often phrase it in a way that they say they've overlooked helping us, they've overlooked doing something they had promised us. They had promised us democracy, they had promised us, as Thomas said, Kenya or Uganda or even the UK in 5 years' time, and they didn't deliver on this. So even though people have these very clear notions of political culture, it's a very different kind of accountability that comes with these kind of notions that the political culture that has been created has been so damaging. So I'm coming to the end. So I was talking a lot about these contradictions that keep recurring and that make engagement and also often understanding so very difficult. And there's a lot of contradictions also in which actors specifically people see as the cause of a crisis and who they think could be a solution. So here are underlying causes of the crisis, a set of institutions. So for example, the justice system is the top one here, which doesn't get great reputation. Traditional authorities is an interesting one, a parliament, and then we have executive, very, very clear what people think. And civil society is also very clear that people do not think civil society is the cause of the problem. Here this is interesting because, of course, traditional authorities in the sort of international development lingo are the solution to everything. And you can see that actually the attitudes to the role that they've played are a lot more ambiguous. And so the society is particularly interesting because people very clearly say they weren't the problem, but on the other hand, very few people actually suggest them as a solution. So it doesn't necessarily translate that actually, we've identified the good actors and we can use this. And then the last question that I just show you is the underlying causes of the current crisis, behavior of individuals. And again, there's interesting findings there. Corruption, individual behavior as corruption, tribalism, individual tribalism, power grabbing is a very strong reason, and other behavior. So every now and then there is a real glimpse of individual accountability. And the criticism given is extremely strong. But also the most convincing path to redemption in the way many people talk about these leaders is also through changing very much individual behavior. So not so many people talk about having to absolutely structurally change the entire setup of the government or the SPLM and so on, but having the need to witness that the leaders can actually change and that they will behave differently. And the way this is often phrased is when people talk about justice, but they don't say we want criminal prosecution, but they talk about just behavior of their leadership, or the need to have justice for everyone in the country, which doesn't mean that everybody needs to go through a criminal trial, but that there needs to be a sense that there is just behavior amongst the citizenship. So I started off by saying, it's really important to understand that these contradictions aren't necessarily, you can't sort them out, and that's then the entry point for a solution. But I do think it's a really useful way of looking at anything that is suggested at the moment, that in the past, oftentimes solutions were attained through really problematic means, and oftentimes implementing a solution created further problems. So I think that's a very, very useful lesson. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Summarise everything.
Show
us the future.
I've not been set an easy task here. There's been some comprehensive presentations. I think I'll just try and pick up on a few points that have been raised, and a few points that from my perspective jump out as being important. It was some elements of my background were discussed earlier. Just to say that I worked in South Sudan for the last 5 years on predominantly on a security sector reform program to try and assist the South Sudanese government to increase accountability and transparency within the security sector. So I spent a large amount of that time as an advisor to the Parliamentary Defence and Security Committee in the National Assembly. So that was one of my roles while I was in South Sudan. I think my background and observations and experiences in South Sudan are probably as much about the political sphere as the security sector. And in my opinion, that's where the issues really need to be looked at in terms of the current crisis. So I'm not going to focus on the security sector so much as the political realities of where we find ourselves now. The topic that I was invited to discuss was on the issue of internal dynamics affecting the post-war state-building process in South Sudan. And I think some of the positives have already been touched on. There was potential in terms of course, the overwhelming post-independence optimism. There was very strong diplomatic international support for the endeavour of state-building in South Sudan. And there were other potentially positive factors like the oil revenue. And there is, cliche as it is, kind of an inherent democratic tendency within the people of South Sudan, within the kind of acephalous structures of many of the tribal groups in South Sudan. It doesn't lend itself well to dictatorship, let's say that. So amongst those positives, there were also clearly a large array of challenges that faced South Sudan on the eve of independence, and Thomas certainly touched on many of the important ones earlier. It strikes me that in a lot of the conversations that have been had about the current crisis in South Sudan, many of them have focused on what I think of as being symptoms, things like poor institutions. But I think that it's important to try and find some kind of separation between what the symptoms are and the causes are that drove those symptoms. I think Marika used the phrase of political culture, which came up in the discussions that she had in Juba. And I think it's an important question to try and understand what drives the political culture in South Sudan today, what really defines the way the political elite has been thinking and calculating since independence. One issue that's always struck me as being tremendously important in the South Sudanese context is the very stark contrast of needs for running the country post-independence to what they were from 2005 to 2011. The CPA was a highly prescriptive document that laid out a very clear pathway for South Sudan to reach a referendum on independence and ultimately to reach independence. And therefore, what was required during the CPA period from the president and the political elite was to essentially to try and keep the show on the road, to try and reach a political accommodation that kept all parties facing in the same direction during some incredibly difficult times. And I'd argue that really the needs for government in South Sudan have been turned on their head since 2011. What's required now is much more of an explicit vision of what the future of the country is and how the people collectively should reach it. And I think that it's striking how much this government was configured for the CPA era rather than for the independence era. It was designed for political accommodation. It wasn't designed, in my opinion, for outlining a strong, coherent strategic vision for the future of the country. Another point that Marika made was this sense of perennial crisis that South Sudan has been in since 1955 with the outbreak of the first civil war, so even before independence in 56. And that has massively defined this political culture in South Sudan and how issues have been dealt with. If we think back even in the last few years, some of the crises that the country has dealt with, be it the North-South relations in general, the issue of the referendum, hedgelage, the oil cut-off. There have been just a whole series of crises coming one after another, all being dealt with in the only way that anybody could see at the time, which is in the most reactive possible way, rather than looking for a kind of strategic solution, as Marika was describing. There's also been throughout this period, I think everyone would agree, a very strong sense of insecurity within government. The government has been fearful of challenges coming both from within and from without. The government has never had a clear preponderance of political authority or arguably of military power, which we've seen now. It's been reactive, it's been unstrategic, which I think is quite understandable considering the inexperience within the government during that period. And I think this helped to bring out a tension between the kind of the two requirements of stability and of inclusivity. Stability was always the short-term preference over the long-term desirability of a more inclusive state. And this has meant that there have been a decreasing number of outlets for any kind of dissent or conversation or grievance about the nature of the state and the way it should develop. And I think we've seen that most clearly within the SPLM recently, where there's been clearly a fear of allowing an open and free-running debate on how the party and how the country more broadly should develop. And of course, in terms of the most immediate causes of the war, the Juba Declaration of 2006 and essentially its failure in December 2013 is one of the clearest examples of this tension between what I think was a genuine intention for inclusivity when the Juba Declaration was signed, but the reality of exclusivity, which has, I think, come to characterize the kind of reactive state as it's tried to lurch from one crisis to the next. Thomas also touched upon the issue of the nascence of institutions in South Sudan. They are, after all, extremely young. And unfortunately, they're beset with poor design. There's been different models have been imported from different contexts, many of them not appropriate to the context of South Sudan. Of course, they're newly established, and patronage runs deeply through those institutions. So in my opinion, it's not necessarily about the bad institutions, which I think came out in Marika's discussion, so much as the absent ones, and the fact that political culture tends to dominate those institutions because they're not robust enough to resist political interests. And this has fed into issues of inadequate service provision and of corruption, which were both touched upon by both speakers. And this has clearly fueled resentment at the sense of inequity, the unequal distribution of resources and wealth. One problem which I also think could be highlighted, and is I think should be part of the discussion on the way out of this crisis and where South Sudan moves next, is the common and outright rejection of ethnicity and even of patronage as legitimate bases for identity, for representation, for loyalty in South Sudan. You know, it's for any South Sudanese person tends to look at themselves first and foremost on the basis of their ethnicity and where they're from. But everybody has been told that this is not a legitimate basis for expressing yourself in the political sphere. So people are being pushed essentially by international norms to express themselves first as a Democrat or a communist rather than as an Equatorian or a Dinka or however they see themselves. And I think that that's entirely problematic in a context that South Sudan has. And I think that really should be part of the conversation of what comes next, and this aspiration for a fairly generic political model which is imported by the international community. And one final point to touch on what Thomas said, I absolutely think there can't be absolution of responsibility for things that have happened within the last few months. But there is clearly a degree of inevitability about the crisis in light of the manifold challenges that South Sudan has faced since independence. So I think that needs to be taken into consideration, particularly in terms of how the international community responds, and to put this within the perspective that Marika outlined, a perennial crisis in the Sudan since independence. And I think that is important to try and contextualize the current reality. So those are my few points. I think it would probably be more interesting to go into a broader conversation.
Fantastic, thanks. Round of applause. That was great. It gives us lots of issues there to explore. So please, let me take a first round of questions from the audience. Can you say who you are? Well, actually, you don't have to, but I'd like you to, unless you want to keep yourself secret for some reason. But, who has a question? No one. There's no questions. You resolved all problems.
One is a comment.
Yeah.
I
Are you going to reveal who you are or keep secret?
No, I'll keep it a secret.
My
name is Justin Gordon. I'm Thomas's brother. I want to commend all the speakers. I mean, they really touch on essential issues of what are the South Sudan current crisis. To some extent, it's a mixture of many of what was said was positive to an extent. Yes, we can dwell on the past, but I think we need to acknowledge that the country is very young. We need to acknowledge also that historically this country has undergone probably a historical mishap. We should have been independent with the rest of Africa 50 years ago. And in light of that, we had the same nationalistic sentiments and consciousness in the 50s, 60s, 70s. We were forced internationally to compromise in 1972, where we lost a lot of what we are looking for today, a sense of national identity. It was lost then. The political turmoil in the Sudan sense, in the South sense, has been power struggles, division by our enemy, dividing our politicians along reparation, tribal as well as regional basis. At the same time, turning our people against each other. We've seen all the wars of the militia wars against the SPLA. Equally, our politicians were disfranchised, because if we all recall, 1972 was actually a sellout, because the South Sudan political movement was absorbed into the Sudan socialist movement. The Nyanya movement was also absorbed into the Sudan's armed forces. So the Southern quest for nationhood and aspirations was decapitated then. When the SPLM picked up the cause, we weren't allowed to express what we were fighting for. So we've been muzzling our cause, and as a result, we've lost focus as to the Southerners, the sense of identity of South Sudan. As everybody argues, we're trying to resurrect it now, but at the same time, we're facing daunting problems. Because clearly, poverty has really wrecked our society. The war also has eroded a lot of our social values and fabric cultural values and our way of life. The over-militarization, which was inevitable, has many people turn against each other, and arms are the only ways to solve our problems. So the government of the day has done its level best, but obviously we needed to be helped in terms of establishing strong institutions, running our monies better, at the same time sorting out the security sector, as Tim said earlier. A lot of those issues, time hasn't really allowed us, and then all of a sudden the selfish leadership tendencies of our leaders has also taken us over. But never least to say that it's not a lost cause, but we have everybody else who has gone before us to learn from. And so I want to ask the speakers, I mean, if we're to look at Africa and look for solutions that South Sudan can learn, because we can surely take the successes and glorious stories of Africa and avoid the pitfalls and the failures. So who, and to what extent can we dwell on the positivity? Because this is a temporary line. Yes, people are hungry for power. People think they can do it better than the other person, but clearly there's problems with institutions, problems with giving the country a chance to breathe. We haven't given our country a chance to breathe. So the way forward is what I would want in terms of who can we emulate and to what role can the international community play to deal with the basics. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. Is there any other? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Arek Joding, just a South Sudanese, I guess.
South Sudanese.
I have 3 questions for each of the panelists, and in the order they spoke. You said that the most desirable solution would be a coalition government. If that was to happen, how do the people of South Sudan go on about that? How do they begin to trust those who will be leading this coalition government? And would the coalition government have a president, per se? So that's one question. My second question is for Dr.
Shamiris. I've been practicing for years. Marika Shamiris, I can do it.
The things that were suggested in the surveys, one of the things that stood out for me was to organize a truth-telling process, and I was also thinking of the Peace and Reconciliation Commission that South Africa had, for example. For South Sudanese, how does that look, and with the apparent tensions that are so strong right now, how does a truth-telling process look like, and how can that dialogue begin? And then for Mr. Dowling, you said since 2011 we require a vision for the future. We can probably, as South Sudanese, we tend to think big, and we can probably come up with a document that can actually picture something that's great for the future and has a beautiful, we have a development vision, I think, 2015 for South Sudan. But the problem is, how do we begin to implement that? What would be your advice to our potential coalition government to implement something that we have already, or something that we can move forward? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to pass it over to the panel. Oh, there's one at the back. Yes.
Yeah.
Big loud voice. Yes.
My name is Bruno.
Yeah.
My question is, I actually have 2 questions. One is on the economy. The South Sudanese economy for the last 7 years during the transition government and after independence. How would you term the distribution of resources in this economy, whichever means they have been distributed, to corruption or whatever? how are the distribution did. And my second question goes specific to marriage. When you talked about the democratic institutions which have been imported, how would you see the tribal institutions playing out in a resource distribution? How would the resources be distributed practically? How would you see that in their outputs?
Oh, suddenly everybody's putting their hands up. Alfred, go on then.
Yeah, I'm Alfred Okech from LSE. My question is in regard to religious leadership. I know that slightly before the crisis, there was disagreement on the role of the National Healing and Reconciliation Committee, which had very much precise role in regard to sorting out tribal differences and tribal issues. And then also, in the middle of the crisis, I know that some of the religious leaders were created with bringing General Yao Yao to a ceasefire agreement. I see less emphasis on the role of religious institutions, and I'm wondering what is your assessment, especially when it comes to the ground. What's your assessment on optimism about the role of religious institutions?
Yeah.
I'm Laurent Taban from South Sudan. My question goes to Alex. There's an underlying perspective in South Sudan that the international community was and is part of the cause of the current crisis in terms of the pressure that they push to the SPLM and to the government to reform, to adopt a democratic principle, which the SPLM is mainly based on protocol seniority, which helped to maintain concurrence all these years. What do you think would be the best arrangement for the current peace process, given that the international community seems to be aligning to democratic calls from the rebel side? There's a general belief I've been in Juba, they said the international community seems to be supporting the rebels and assisting the government. So
Okay.
is there any way the community can come out positively to?
Could you hear at the back that question about the international community and its role in the present crisis, and whether or not the international community, whatever that is actually already aligning itself with one of the factions, and whether that's actually part of the problem? Is there a question at the front there as well?
Yeah, but I think I have to wait a little bit.
You're going to wait because you're still thinking about it, or because
No,
the muse hasn't descended?
Okay, no, I can ask if you want me to ask.
No, I'll come back to you, but
Yeah, I think better come back.
I'll come back to you. Let's I thought the point about the international community, I'll come back to you in a minute, we'll have another round, but I think the point about the international community, whatever that is, seems to be something that I would like the panellists to speak about, because I do feel that got a bit muted. You know, at the time of the Addis Ababa Agreement, I remember there was lots of publicity about this being an outbreak of sanity in world affairs. It seemed to be a compromise that had resolved matters in some way in South Sudan, and there was a huge surge of enthusiasm about it, with a massive campaign of international assistance, one of the biggest up to that point, in fact, in the 1970s. And then after the CPA, another huge surge of enthusiasm. So it's not as though there hasn't been a great deal of interest and optimism about South Sudan. So is that part of the problem, or where does that fit? Would South Sudan not be in this position if it hadn't inspired such enthusiasm from the international community? Who are we going to begin with? In the same order. Thomas, you go first.
Right, I think, shall we answer the first question first, right? And then everybody will have...
Cherry pick what you like.
Okay. I think your question, let me see, the question about the coalition government. Yes, that was you, wasn't it? Yeah. That's a difficult one, because if you have a government that has skin in it and Riek with it, Riek supporters will say Kiir is a killer, is a murderer, he failed to protect Nuers. This is the perception of the opposition. Whether it was intentional or whether it was because of failure to control the army in Juba, Nuers were massacred. and Kiir is responsible. He has to go. If Riek comes back in the coalition, then the supporters of Kiir will say, this is unfair. What has Kiir done? He hasn't finished his term. Why are you destroying our democracy? We elect our president. You don't impose it on us. We will elect or reject Kiir at the end in the elections 2015, and nobody else should interfere with this. So you can see the big tensions there. That's why I was saying that actually the onus is on Kiir and Riek, us leaders of South Sudan, to each think deeply and make steps towards the compromise, the only way that that peace would be achieved. Once that is done, then really we're not saying that this coalition should be permanent. The coalition might be without the two, or whatever it is. As long as it's agreed between Kiir and Riek, we'll have some sort of results from ideas. But the way to sell it to the population would be that this is going to be a temporary arrangement. It's not permanent. It's only a transitional government. And there are a few things that have to be done in the interim period. First of all, we have to finish our constitution. Secondly, I think there would be a re-registration of all the parties, because I think constitutionally now, no party is actually legal according to the Constitution of South Sudan now. So there'll be a registration of all the parties, including the SPLM. And maybe the SPLM will, by that time, because we have the hegemony of the SPLM as one party now, which is in a way had been the strength of South Sudan, but now it's becoming the weakness of South Sudan. Because one of the problems that this problem happened is Riek did not feel that he could actually leave the party, create his own party and be elected. He knew that there was only one way to get into power. And the only way he was going to get that into power is to become the SPLM candidate. And there's no way he was going to be the SPLM candidate if Kiir had not stepped down. That's how the problem happened. So perhaps with the new party registration, we might come up with more evenly distributed new parties and finish the constitution and then go back to elections, and maybe that would be the way to go forward.
Right, yeah.
Thank you.
Cherry pick the ones that you want to pick.
Okay, well, actually, since you ignored your brother, I will take your brother's question.
I noticed that. I noticed that they've been talking about it at home.
And actually, Justin's question links very closely to Taban's about the international community. What can they do to help, or indeed have they already taken sides? And I think there's, again, I don't want to bore you to death with this theme of contradictions, but I think that theme also really works very well in looking in the role of the international community, because in many ways, over the past 10 years or even before, they have engaged in a very contradictory way and have never actually reconciled very contradictory and very approaches that are full of tensions. And I give you a few examples. One, for example, which comes now back as a real genuine problem, is that on the one hand they have supported very much the democratic process. The elections were only written into the CPA as a milestone because the US government insisted on it. So the elections had to happen, but then the contradiction was that when they happened and they really happened in a very bad way. They didn't actually step up and said, well, actually, these weren't up to, there were very subdued criticism that they weren't up to international standards, but actually nobody came out and said these elections were worth nothing. Because at the time, the most important thing was to get to the referendum and go through with the referendum. So that setup was very contradictory, and is now creating that exact same problem, which Taban, who has just been called, mentioned. It's a really difficult situation for the international community, because on the one hand, they years ago endorsed this government as a legitimate government, democratically elected government. But now, on the other hand, of course, it's very difficult to support outright this government, which is also engaging in very, very problematic activity. I wouldn't go as far as to say, I don't honestly know whether the international community has taken sides, but I think they've never reconciled these contradictions. Another one, which is very clear, is that for many years the main approach to development in South Sudan was actually to seek out areas of conflict and put a lot of development aid and a lot of money and a lot of conflict resolution money into areas of conflict. So there's this saying in South Sudan that actually it's better for your development projects, for your infrastructure, if you have a local conflict, because then stuff will come to you. And obviously that's a real contradiction with supporting peaceful approaches and so on, and just pursuing straightforward development, which is often very, very difficult to pursue in conflict situations. And another one is that they've never clearly decided what they are actually supporting in South Sudan. Are they supporting the creation of a state with a very strong central government, or are they supporting a decentralized government that devolves to the very local level? Where actually, I think, it goes back to Justin's question, a lot of the answers lie. I think a process in Addis Ababa looks at a very different dynamic than any local situations. And what we have seen, of course, also during the course of the crisis, that people have managed to create local pockets of peace, and often through very interesting means. If you think back of the speech of the governor of Western Equatoria, who said very early on in the crisis, no Nuer has to defect from the SPLA in Western Equatoria, we will protect you. He actually went in and he brought out a few Nuer commanders to make sure that people could see that they would be safe. But he also said, but we do not want these problems here. So once this is over, all of you have to leave. Now that's an interesting approach to creating actually a pocket of peace. And I don't think people have paid enough attention to this. So what can the international community do? I think one really crucial point is to be honest about these contradictions, which to me is sort of the best way to approach any of these issues. That there isn't, it's just not the situation where you say, well, actually this is more true than another description of the situation, and we have it figured out. Because I think only with this really genuine and honest engagement with these contradictions can there ever be anything useful that comes of this. Which takes me directly to your question on how can this begin the truth-telling process, and how could some sort of copy of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission even look like in South Sudan? And I think one really important point is, I don't really have a very well-formed opinion whether I think this is a good solution, but I think one thing that comes back time and time again, and in so many conversations that I have, is there's really an urgent need to very publicly acknowledge the price ordinary people have paid for South Sudanese independence. It's such a strong, sore point with so many people that there has always been this story that this was an achievement of the army, which now is often translated, of course, to sort of a sense of entitlement of military actors. I think that's a really, really important point for any truth-telling process. The other one is, again, it takes us back to this theme of contradictions. Very often this idea of a truth-telling process is driven by this idea that people need to find a shared narrative. They need to kind of find a way of agreeing on a history. And I think that's, again, the exact wrong approach, because I don't think that's possible. That wouldn't be possible anywhere. That wouldn't even be possible in a borough in London, because people have such different memories. What's really important is to find a way how these can coexist. So the story of one particular group of people in the war will always be very contradictory to another, but reconciling these, I think, is what the process needs to do, and acknowledging that the different stories exist. And just maybe one last very brief point on the economy. It's just a really important point to make, because it so much fits into the bigger picture of South Sudan. Yes, of course, there was all of a sudden the oil shut down, and all of a sudden the country basically had no revenue. But the really fascinating thing about this is that a lot of things did not collapse. Because, of course, one obvious reason is because a lot of the oil money never trickled down to anybody and didn't really play much of a role anyway. But there's another contradiction there where people say, but we need to make sure that this income comes in, because that's the only way to run the country. Yes, it's obviously better if income comes in, but there are clearly also other ways, which I think haven't been looked at enough in enough detail to understand how was it possible that actually for a lot of people life didn't change as much as it should have when the oil was shut down. For a lot of people it did, but for the vast majority it didn't.
Alex.
I would love to cherry pick, but I think there are questions that were put to me, so I'll probably have to focus on those ones. On the first question from Arek, which was about the fact that it's easy for South Sudanese to generate ambitious visions about how to implement them. I agree with you. There are a number of very bold and impressive visions outlining the future of South Sudan, and the South Sudan Development Plan is one of them. Vision 2040 was another. There are some really excellent documents out there that we could all applaud. But I think at this stage in South Sudan's development, I think the process of developing those visions is probably far more important than the outcome. And those visions were essentially either donor-driven or elite-driven exercises in small rooms in which very nice words were generated and put onto paper, but there was never any sense that they were owned by, as a result of some kind of collective endeavour by the people of South Sudan through some kind of big conversation. So I think that the first part of my answer would be inclusivity has to be the means through which a genuinely South Sudanese vision for the future is generated. I was part of a process last year to draft a national security policy for South Sudan. I supported the committee that was doing the drafting, and there was a public consultations process that went round the 10 states and also separately the institutions of the capital in Juba, to ask the basic questions of how did people perceive security and what kind of things did they see for the future of the state. I think that was a hugely important landmark, and I hope that that document will be endorsed. So I think the second half of my answer would be accountability. If citizens are involved in a discussion on how the country should look, then it gives them a greater voice to hold to account the people that they've addressed their vision to. So I think a combination of those two things is hugely important, and they are often trite cliches which are pulled out at times of crisis, but I think that as concepts for how a vision can be generated and implemented in South Sudan, they're extremely important. The second question to me was on the issue, responding to my comment on imported democratic models and how to distribute resources through ethnic means. I mean, I think I would probably argue that largely that already happens. I think both formally and informally, the resources that come through the South Sudanese governments are redistributed through ethnic channels, either informally by individuals shifting resources towards their communities, or even more formally, because the administrative boundaries of South Sudan tend to reflect the borders of ethnic groups, and the administrative boundaries define the distribution of resources of the state at the local level. My concern is that reality is not reflected in the political arena and the way that politics is discussed and unfortunately fought for in South Sudan. There's a tendency to pretend that that's not the case and that that's not the defining structure for the distribution of resources in South Sudan. So I think somewhere or other there needs to be a means of bringing together these two parallel realities to look at how they could function better in the future. The third question to me was the question from Taban about what the international community could do positively to contribute. And also your suggestion that in Juba the perception is that the international community is already aligned with the rebels and their calls for democracy. It's funny because if you talk to the rebels, I think they have completely the opposite view, that the international community is aligned with the government, and they're very annoyed that the international community has not been more damning in its indictment of the government for the events of December. And I think that probably reflects the fact that the international community has not really given a clear and coherent line on the current crisis in South Sudan. I personally would like to see a more coherent line. I would like to see the international community take a stand, and much like I've called for the South Sudanese government, I'd like to see a coherent vision from the international community now to say we recognise that there has been a step change in South Sudan, and this is how we would like to respond to it collectively. I haven't seen that, and I think that feeds into the paranoia and the rumour that both sides believe the international community is supporting the other. I've seen no evidence that the international community is supporting one side or other. Of course, by international community, I think you're using that as shorthand probably for the wider international community, because I think the regional dynamics are far more complicated. I think these are hugely important conversations. I think that there's another meeting in a couple of weeks on the external dynamics, which is why I steered clear of it in my presentation. But I think it is very important. It's probably the elephant in the room that we can't really ignore. I think that in terms of what the international community can do to contribute now, beyond that clear vision statement, I think they need to be much more bold in making demands for certain changes. You said that the international community had been too intrusive in certain areas, or at least that was the perception of some people. I think that this crisis emanated from the SPLM, from within the party, and I don't sense that the international community ever tried to really engage in the conversation of the problems that were very apparent in the SPLM last year. The only country that did was South Africa, which really did attempt to have, I think, probably a closed-door conversation with the SPLM leadership on how to try and avert a crisis and move forward as a party. I think that conversation needs to be had with, or the international community at least needs to give its position on what it sees it can support in terms of the development or the transition of the SPLM away from this crisis.
Can I say something quickly about the international community? Since you...
I was just wondering, it's 8 o'clock, all right? So what I would like to do is I'd take another very short round of questions, and then Thomas would come back then. Is that all right? There was a question over there. Did you have your question? You had a hand up before. Do you still have a question?
I think it's been answered.
It's been answered. Excellent. I'm going to leave you to the end, so you've got plenty of time to think about it. Yeah.
Hi, President Master, the former EU Special Representative for Sudan and South Sudan. I have a question about security sector reform. I wonder if I could put that to Alex, given your long first-hand experience in that area. A lot of the focus has been on the political crisis within the SPLM in triggering the current crisis. But there's clearly now a major crisis also in the SPLA, and despite calls by the SPLA Chief of Staff for the army to stay out of politics, we've obviously seen a significant number of SPLA soldiers engaging in political violence on one side or the other. We heard from the speakers about the long-standing issue of the problem of having to integrate large numbers of militia formerly backed by Khartoum into the SPLA, that process was sort of incomplete, and so that in a way it was already a coalition of ethnic militias. But I wanted to ask Alex how he sees now the prospects if when we get to that stage for security sector reform going forward, for reintegrating the military and trying to create a genuine South Sudanese national army.
Thanks. Yes. Go on then.
My name is Martin. I'm a student at FBC. And this goes to Thomas. Thomas, if we have to believe that what's happening right now is in South Sudan teaches us anything about history, to what extent do you think what is the history of South Sudan is going to shape up what's going to happen next, beyond today or beyond this conflict, and under what circumstances? I know it's a total order. Then to any of either Marika or
Alex.
Inherent to the process of forming a coalition government is accommodation. In the process of accommodation, there is a strong possibility, and almost always a possibility, that you empower past culprits and give them even much more authority. Is there a better option, or if that is the only thing you would want to look at, in what circumstance would that work out better so that we don't carry on with the future of impunity? Thank you.
And you have a question?
Yeah, my name is Paul Motat. My question is about security, but was to Alex, but I think it was been asked already on the SPLA group, and when they were integrated, what was the level of cooperation between the SPLM integrated group and the principal SPLA army? Was there a gap between them, or is it a contributing factor? To Dr. Marika, about nationalism of South Sudan. I mean, the question, whoever answered the question, that they don't have a sense of national nationalism. I think it's not 100% true, because it was the driving force behind the wars of independence for 50 years. It's why people went to the bush, why they were fighting in both the Ghanaian one and the SPLA. And the SPLM. And I think that their driving force, that what brought us, in the end is what led them to vote for independence in 2011. What I may accept in this is that maybe the ruling party or the government has actually nourished it after independence. It hasn't gone back to them and to them now with independence. This is what you can get. And I think that was missed in between for all kind of reasons. Some of them being outlined by Thomas. For Thomas, I have a question to do with, we did address the issue of tribalism. How can we get out of it? How can we sort of, what way can we think about it in the future in terms of handling it in a way that will not lead to another violent, which is very sad for most husbands, for all of us, it's very sad.
Right. Thank you. So, did you have a question you wanted to ask? Just a quick one.
Yeah. My name is Thomas. I'm on the IDHG program at LSE. I was just wondering, like, to what extent do you think that there's an incentive for political parties in South Sudan to use kind of ethnicity and politicize it in order to kind of strengthen various kind of forms of power and wealth and so on for various individuals? I don't know the names that well, but yeah. To what extent is ethnicity instrumentalized almost in the political sphere in South Sudan?
Okay, thank you. So, I'll let the panelists give short responses to those questions and maybe add any other last comments. We're already 5 minutes past 8, so perhaps keep it fairly brief. Yeah, should we go in the same order again? Tom, you had something else to say about the international community as well.
I'll skip that because of the
If
time.
it's interesting, give it to us.
Okay. Regarding all I would say about the international community role is the first thing, as Justin mentioned there, in the case of Addis Ababa agreement, South Sudanese felt betrayed. So even though it's perceived university as a big thing, for the majority of South Sudan, they were sold out in 1972. So that's one. In relation to the current situation now, certain crisis, there is a confusion in South Sudan. There's a lot of dithering and hesitation in the international community. We don't see which way they're going. For example, on the one hand, from the rebel side, because Obama and the Obama administration has said that we will not support the overthrow of the government of South Sudan by force, that's by consequence in their interpretation, that's a statement against them. But from the government side, they say, okay, if you are against insurgents, why are you letting cities being captured? Why are you not condemning what is happening in Malakal or Bor, and people are being massacred? Everything that has been built there since 2005 is being destroyed. Why are you not responding to that? So obviously, even in that one stance, you can find contradiction there. And also yesterday, which we led in the Congress briefing, which included Mr. Booth, who is the current U.S. envoy to Sudan and South Sudan. He made a statement which is very interesting as well. He said that this time is we should not give space to the government of South Sudan to try and fix the situation and give some accommodation to a few people and go back to business as usual. Obviously, in South Sudan, this is being read as not dithering at all. This is being meant as a recommendation for regime change. So the role of the international community is quite dubious, it's quite confusing in the state of South Sudan. It would be nice if they could very quickly and clearly clear the center, but this vacuum is causing more trouble in South Sudan. Coming back to your question, Martin, about lessons learned. My interpretation to your question is these events are hopefully a lesson for South Sudan, and how South Sudan going to look back at this at this juncture. I think it came as a shock to the population of South Sudan. We never thought that things would change so quickly and so violently. So that's a very big shock, and that's how it's going to be remembered. And hopefully, at the moment, two things are being revised. People are looking at themselves in the government and saying, okay, they're trying to revise how they have run the country for the first time. And I think there is a new rejuvenation where people are saying, where did we go wrong? So I think that's an asset. Secondly, as well, is going to remind people about how the strengths of ethnic divides in South Sudan, maybe people are going to approach them more sensitively moving forward. As I respond to that, question of tribalism, Paul.
Yes, quick.
Yeah. The question of tribalism, I think I'm going to go back to something that Africans have debated a long time. Is the tribe a curse for Africa, or is it a blessing? And I think it's, for most Africans, there will be no doubt that tribe is a blessing, because these are our true national identities that were found when colonialism came. However, we find ourselves in this situation where we have to do a transformation. But a tribe is not a simple thing. A tribe is a unique language, it's a way of life, it's religion, so many things. It's actually what you are. But these things are being challenged heavily and being put under severe pressure. Is actually amounts to the loss of civilization. So people have to reborn, learn and mix in many different ways between different cultures. In the case of South Sudan, it's very confusing. Bit of Arabic culture, bit of English culture, bit of general Western culture, and bit of South Sudanese or tribal culture, which is very confusing. And that's what we are battling with. So the tribalism is the negative side of being proud of your tribe. I think the government of South Sudan should have and should continue to recover what has been lost for all the ethnic groups in terms of their language, in terms of their history. The new generation should go back to learning and reading their languages, which we lost. The Sudanese, the British taught every South Sudanese more or less their language, but the Northern Sudanese destroyed this in the name of the creation of new nation, that we are all going to become Arabic speaking, and hopefully, Muslims as well, which we obviously rejected. But in the meantime, the last 40 years, 50 years since we've been under the Sudanese, Northern Sudanese administration, none of all the South Sudanese that have come through the school system can read their own language. This was one of the first mandates that the government of South Sudan should have done. To be a part of your culture and your history does not mean that you have to treat your fellow citizen unfairly, and I think those two should go together.
Thank you.
I'll be very quick.
Yes.
But I forgot Alfred's question. I have to answer it because Alfred has toiled a lot to make these events happen. So, about religious leaders, I have to say that it wasn't so clear in our answers, not as clear as with traditional authorities, the sort of ambivalence that people feel. I do think there's another really interesting point to this, because the reason why there may be some ambivalence is because the church, of course, has played very contradictory roles in previous incarnations of the South Sudanese war. And I do find one development there really striking and interesting, which was that Archbishop Deng gave a rousing sermon in the church in early January, where he made a very important point, which is that in this moment of crisis, this is really the moment for every single person to step back and say, what have I done and what do I need to adjust to actually change things? And very clearly, the international community, the SPLM, every individual actor, and he made a very strong point and said the church needs to do the same. We need to start with our own role, the very contradictory roles that we've played in the South Sudanese Civil War. So I think that's a very encouraging signal, and I think obviously there's competition between the various reconciliation outlets and committees and so on, but I think that's something that people really noticed, that he made this point that everybody needs to take a look at themselves, which might empower them again to become a very credible actor. And very brief answers to the other two questions. Accommodation runs the danger of empowering past culprits and giving them authorities. Are there better options? Yes, that's one of the big problems. I think what's a really striking characteristic of a lot of processes that we've seen in South Sudan, and I don't want to call them simply reconciliation and justice processes because they're more complex than that, but they are always driven by this notion that individuals need to very publicly show that they've changed behavior. It's not enough to say things, it's not enough to kind of do things half-heartedly, but people need to really see changed behavior. And I think it's also an impossibility to say, well, the entire leadership that has had power over the past few years needs to go and somebody else needs to come in. I think that it will have to be more nuanced than that, but I think the answer lies in finding ways where individuals can very visibly change their behavior and work very visibly towards a different shared goal. And the final point on nationalism, I find this really very interesting because you kind of confirmed the point that I made earlier about the truth and reconciliation approach, because you said the point that this person made about nationalism is not true. Well, for this person, it's very true.
I'm not saying it's not 100% correct.
Well, it's not 100% correct, but that's exactly my point. There are so many different stories that there won't ever be an agreement, because of course a lot of people would argue nationalism wasn't why people went to the bush. they went to the bush because they wanted a new Sudan. They didn't want a separate South Sudan. There's all these. We don't need to discuss which is right or wrong, but this is exactly the point, that there are so many stories, and in a way, any kind of truth-telling reconciliation process needs to find a way to accommodate all of these and realize that every single one of them is as important to the people who have experienced this. So for some people, maybe nationalism was absolutely 100% the cause and is very, very strong now. For other people, it isn't. For some, one person said to me, we can't get rid of the SPLM. If we get rid of the SPLM, we become Somalia. Another person writes, to hell with SPLM. All these things somehow need to be able to coexist. Thank you. And Alex.
I'll be very quick. Well, I think two questions were asked to me on the issue of security sector reform and the security sector. On the question of what prospect for security sector reform, I mean, I tried to differentiate earlier between what I would see as symptoms and what I would see as causes of this crisis. And in my opinion, the breakup of the security sector wasn't necessarily a cause of the crisis so much as a symptom of it. And I think you can make the same differentiation between the kind of technical and political aspects of security sector reform. As a technical exercise, it's quite straightforward. I mean, there are a series of templates that could be offered for how to develop a security sector, but of course it's politics that always gets in the way. So in terms of these kind of political causes, I think really it's these key points of the political rivalry, the suspicion, the kind of narrowing of the political space, and the perceived sense of exclusion, which permeated throughout the political and the military sphere, which really prevented security sector reform from ever really taking hold. There wasn't really buy-in to the fundamental principles of professionalisation, of downsizing the army, because there are more immediate political requirements, which kind of militated against that kind of process. And that, I guess, is connected to the question that you asked about the integration process, and predominantly the integration process of the Juba Declaration in 2006, and the inclusion of the SSDF forces, which now essentially form the key personnel within the opposition forces under Riek Machar, which I think in itself is probably a demonstration that the Juba Declaration process was not a success. And again, I think it's the same reasons. I think it comes down to the broader political tensions, the lack of willingness to open up the political space, and an attempt to use the army as an alternative platform through which to try and reconcile challenges to the status quo. Until there is a process of actually opening up the political space and allowing real power to be shared, I think that those problems will continue even if there is a renewed integration. The problem now is that if everybody starts to look at the future process of security sector reform as a repeat of bringing back the SSDF forces into the SPLA, I don't think there's going to be much appetite from any side, because it will just be a repeat of the same challenges, the same problems, but with an additional layer of tensions and bitterness. So this really needs to be looked at again from a much more political perspective that really looks at the underlying causes and the blockages that prevented the security sector reform as a technical exercise from proceeding since 2005.
Thank you. Well, we're going to finish at that point. I'm just going to sort of end by just saying that I thought there was very interesting exchanges for me between the two brothers. But there was something that Justin said that he very much gave the impression that South Sudan doesn't have the same experience as other African countries, its neighbours. It hasn't had that experience of statehood. It's very divided. I'm thinking, well, I've worked on Uganda since 1980. One might not like some aspects of President Museveni's Uganda, but believe me, Uganda in the early 1980s, it was a bitterly divided country, and something was possible there. So on March 18th, we start looking at these comparisons with neighbouring countries. The other thing that struck me was the point you made, where you talked about different possible scenarios, and the one that you ruled out as the worst of all scenarios was a mandate arrangement, where South Sudan becomes some sort of territory administered for a period by the United Nations, which after all was what the United Nations was partly set up to do, or by the African Union. Why is that a totally impossible response to the situation?
Yeah, where have they done it successfully? Where
Well,
has the UN
we
done
can
it
tell us
successfully?
on March the 18th, we can put it all on the table and have a fight about it.